Well, Tony Abbott, thank you so much for sitting down with us. Now, firstly, you're a Spectator author. You wrote a great piece over the summer about reading the Pell diaries. Now, I am not a Catholic personally, but I followed very closely the Pell case, and to me, this is the anti-Christian sort of flavour or sentiment in the community among the media and so on. It's becoming almost sub-rational. Why do you think the Pell case was so important, not just for the Catholic community, but as a matter of natural justice and procedural fairness and justness?
Plainly, there are issues in the Victorian justice system. You wouldn't have the Lawyer X Royal Commission if everything was hunky-dory.
Correct.
In the administration of justice in Victoria. Plainly, as we now know from the High Court verdict, which was about as comprehensive as is possible, he should never have been investigated. He should never have been charged. He should never have been convicted. And he should have got off on the first appeal because the case was without any credible foundation.
And what did you enjoy, or what insights did you take from the Pell diary?
I'd encourage people to read the Pell diaries. I'd encourage people to buy the Pell diaries because this is the distilled reflection on many important subjects of a truly impressive, learned and decent man.
Well, and was an excellent review as well, and I encourage everybody to read it in the Spectator at spectator.com.au. But turning also to the Spectator, there was a great piece by Paul Collitts a little while ago comparing yourself to the great Donald Trump, and the similarities are there. You were both made huge headway with a lot of reform in a very short period of time. You both were accused of populism and sloganeering when really that was code for actually speaking to the people who you represent and over whom you govern. You both taken from office before your time.
My hairstyle wasn't as flamboyant.
Oh well, you know, there's always room for a makeover and always room to experiment. But what do you think the legacy of Donald Trump is as really a leader from that mould?
I've got to be honest with you, Gideon. He has not behaved well since the election.
Yeah,
I suppose he was always going to be a sore loser. You don't have to like losing, but you've got to respect the people's verdict. And for all the things that might have looked a bit fishy on the night, no court anywhere in the United States was convinced that there was anything fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
But look, while he might have been a sore loser, he was in many respects quite a good president. He was a president who, whatever you think of him personally, had great political integrity. He said he would pull out of Paris, and he did. He said he'd cut taxes, and he did. He said he'd boost defence, and he did. He said he'd move the embassy to Jerusalem, and he did. He was someone who strove mightily to keep his promises, and until the coronavirus hit, the American economy was performing extremely well, much better than it had for many years, and the beneficiaries of the much better performing economy were workers whose wages were going up in real terms for the first time in a generation, and minorities. I mean, female unemployment, lowest in history, black unemployment, lowest in history, as well as wages that were finally leaping ahead of inflation. So look, he was a good president, and I suspect that history will be kinder to him than his contemporaries right now. Yeah,
well, look, you'd think so. And just like history was kinder to Ronald Reagan, I think we forget that Ronald Reagan was loathed, the same way George W. Bush was loathed.
And at the time, John Howard wasn't exactly popular.
Correct.
With people who now regard him as quite the statesman.
Correct. It's easy to forget that. Well, one area in which Donald Trump was very strong and very assertive was on China. And during your term as Prime Minister, we did not have the same concerns about China as we do now. I mean, this is less than 10 years ago. And I remember when your government signed, you and Andrew Robb, who were the best team on trade I think we had since John Howard and John Anderson back in the day. To great fanfare, your government signed CHAFTA, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which was almost universally seen as a big, big win at the time. What do you think has changed in the China debate so quickly in the space of 5 or 6 years?
There's no doubt that China has changed, and there's no doubt that our perceptions of China have changed. In 2015, you were still entitled to think that as China economically liberalised, it would ultimately politically liberalise. No one thinks that now. And obviously, China has demonstrated in the South China Sea, in the bullying of its neighbours, even India, in its treatment of the Uyghurs, in its assault on the basic freedoms of Hong Kong, and now in its quite alarming threats against Taiwan. China has demonstrated that it is bent on regional hegemony and ultimately perhaps even global domination. And I have to say that a world dominated by China will be a vastly different and, in my judgment, a much worse world than a world which is basked in that long glow of Anglo-American ascendancy. It's been a very benign ascendancy, and any future Chinese ascendancy, as long as the Beijing regime remains as it is, will be quite different. We really do need to be very careful of Taiwan. Taiwan is a liberal democracy of 25 million people. It's in very grave peril, and we need to be talking to our allies about contingencies. And we need to be thinking about the sort of consequences that will need to be imposed on Beijing if it does take the sort of drastic measures short of war that people now fear. Trade boycotts, fifth column activities, attempts to close down Taiwan's transport and communications links, cyber attacks and so on. It won't be good enough just to have conferences about this.
No.
There will need to be serious action in response.
Yeah, and do you see a red line emerging around Taiwan? I mean, what happens when that Rubicon is crossed?
Well, I think that if a vibrant democracy of 25 million people can be crushed, a vibrant democracy whose only crime is to exist 100 miles across the Taiwan Straits from mainland China, and the malevolence of the Beijing regime, I think democracy everywhere, freedom everywhere is under very serious challenge.
And layered on top of the China issue, of course, is Corona and where it came from, the origins of it. And the other element that's causing difficulty with China is that every time we open our mouths and call them out for their human rights breaches, their territorial ambitions, they retaliate with trade. Now, I'm somebody who often says we should not put climate change before Australian jobs. We should not even put the coronavirus and lockdowns before Australian jobs in most cases. Some damage is inevitable, but we didn't have to go as far as we did. When you think about the fact that there are Australian cattle producers who may have to cull their herds, the jobs that are being lost in multiple sectors whenever China pushes a button and jacks up tariffs, how can we say, or should we say, that standing up to China should come before Australian jobs? I personally think that we do, but it's how do you reconcile that?
We don't want to gratuitously offend anyone, but in the end, we can't be bullied by anyone either. And in the end, we've got to be true to ourselves. Now, we want to be as prosperous as we humanly can, but not at the cost of kowtowing to anyone. And the good thing is that notwithstanding the difficulties that we've got, our exports to China have actually gone up over the last 12 months. And without wanting to minimise the consequences, should there be, for argument's sake, sanctions applied to China at some point in time, because much of what we export to China are commodities which are fungible, I think it will not be as hard as we sometimes fear to find alternative markets.
Well, one criticism that's levelled against the current government and the current Prime Minister is that he's not managing the relationship well. Now, John Howard, for example, is somebody, and yourself, frankly, as Prime Minister, managed the relationship with China exceptionally well. Is managing the relationship well impossible today, or are these criticisms fair?
I don't think they're fair at all. it's not Scott Morrison who's to blame for the problems with China, it's Beijing who's to blame for the problems with China. There is nothing that we have said about China that is not perfectly reasonable. There is nothing that we have done in respect of China that is not perfectly defensible. We're not using hysterical language about China, talking about chewing gum on the sole of Australia's boot or anything like that. We're not talking we're not making sort of threats against China. We're just saying that we will obviously act in accordance with our national interests and our national values.
Correct. Well, continuing on with Corona, I mean, I personally, as a lot of people know, have been horrified by the broad response to the coronavirus. We've seen thousands of people chucked out of work. We've seen, for example, state borders, Australians divided from Australian. Now, these border closures have been left in the hands of the states. They've been wildly inconsistent, very difficult, not least of all inconvenient. And basically, we've seen a summer in which there have been a whole group of people within Australia become effectively internally displaced people. Meanwhile, from my point of view, the Commonwealth has not done what a federal government should do and invoke Section 92 and demand that we are a federation, we are one country. What do you make of the federal government and the broader question of state borders and the open shut dynamic that we're sort of lumped with now?
Look, I'm not going to give the PM advice because I understand the difficult position that he's trying to manage. But I certainly do think that it's wrong to close state borders. I think it's wrong to shut Australians out from different parts of the country purely on the basis that you might be from New South Wales and you might be seeking to go to Victoria or vice versa. All credit to Gladys Berejiklian that she's been the least trigger happy of the premiers in this area. Look, if a premier decides for public health reasons that it's necessary to impose restrictions on the people of a particular suburb or a particular town, maybe that could, under certain circumstances,
limited, localised,
be justified.
Yeah.
But to say that New South Welshmen can't come to Victoria or Victorians can't go to Queensland or no one can go to Western Australia, I just think that's completely at odds with the spirit of the Constitution and it just shouldn't happen.
No, it shouldn't. And looking at more fallout from Corona, very famously in 2010, one of the 4 pillars of the 2010 campaign for the coalition was pay back the debt. We are now in a Liberal government still after so many years. We're heading towards $1 trillion worth of debt. Does that worry you?
Of course it does, but it worries Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison just as much because they were key parts of the government that did do a very great deal to get us back into a position of balance, and we were in a position of balance at the start of last year. Unfortunately, the budget was hit by force majeure. Now, I'm very pleased that both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer are determined that businesses have got to stand on their own 2 feet, that benefits that were extended in the emergency circumstances of the early days of the pandemic are being withdrawn because, as in 2013, so in 2021, like households, like businesses, government too has got to live within its means. Yes, government has greater borrowing capacity. Yes, government
money printing capacity
can do things that ordinary citizens can't. But eventually, it all has to be paid back. And the last thing you want to do is to needlessly saddle your children and your grandchildren with debts because of our difficulties in this generation. So I think much of what's happened has been unavoidable, and good on the government for wanting to return to fiscal normalcy as quickly as possible.
Well, here's hoping. And I mean, you talked about paying off the debt and about, that'll require economic growth. We have to grow our way out of the debt. We have to be able to live within our means, as you said, pay off the $1 trillion of in hock that we've ended up in. At the same time, the Prime Minister has basically given a soft nod to net zero emissions by 2050. We at the IPA have had concerns about how that'll affect growth. We've talked about it. Now, you won an election in a landslide opposing the worst excesses of climate change hysteria and the carbon tax. Scott Morrison won the last election by opposing Labor's crazy plans for climate, and now we're ended up with this net zero by 2050 position. Is there some sort of dissonance here, or is this...
That's not what the Prime Minister has said. I was listening to the Prime Minister's National Press Club speech the other day, and he said, we want to get emissions as low as possible, as fast as possible, preferably by 2050. But there has been no target. I doubt, frankly, that there will be any target, and certainly no time soon, because we've got a 2030 target and it's 10 years before we meet that. We are on track to do so. But look, as the PM said in the last election of the Labor Party, it would be highly irresponsible to set a target that you couldn't cost, nor demonstrate how it's going to be achieved. So I think we'll just keep doing what we're doing, which is to take common sense, no regrets measures, look at business introducing new technology, look at business trying to minimise its costs. We've already reduced our emissions by 13% since 2005. We've reduced our emissions intensity by well over 50% in the last 20 years, just because no one wants to pay more than they have to. No one wants to squander more resources than they need to. So good common sense measures by good common sense Australians, individually and corporately, that's what will get us to a better place.
And finally, Mr. Abbott, why is the Australian way of life important? What's at stake here?
Well, as we often say these days, politics is downstream of culture. And if you want to know why a whole lot of pretty crazy things are happening in the political world, look at the sort of things that are happening in the educational world. Look at the sort of things that are being talked about by academics at our universities. Now, I'm all in favour of free speech. I'm dead against left-wing indoctrination. And I think the best counter to what I think is a false view of our history and a false conception of our national character is to tell what I believe is the truth about our history and to celebrate all the good things in our national character. And the best thing of all is our determination to have a go. That is the quintessential Australian attitude, to roll up your sleeves and have a go. It's what has made us great up till now, and it's what we need to preserve and encourage to make us great in the future.
It's an interesting contrast because you do see a small elite, typically in the public service or in universities or in these salaried positions, who take a very negative view of Australian history and culture and the Australian project itself. At the same time, Australia Day has never been more popular. Anzac Day has, having, before we shut them all down, had record dawn services and marches. Are people reacting, I guess, against this black armband view of history, or is it just something inbuilt in the Australian character?
Most people don't have the chance to appear on television or to write articles for newspapers or to stand up in front of a few hundred people and give a lecture. But people can turn up on Anzac Day to dawn service. They can turn up to a citizenship ceremony on Australia Day. And I think this is millions and millions of Australians voting with their feet in favour of our country, just as every migrant has voted with his or her feet for Australia. When you turn up at an Australia Day event, or when you go and watch an Anzac Day march, you are demonstrating your respect and commitment to our country.
And it's I guess a small commitment of time, but it's important and it means something, and it's a way of...
It's like going to visit your grandparents. It's like going to your cousin's wedding. It's like ringing up your best mates on their birthdays. I mean, that's what it is. It's a practical demonstration of our commitment our kinship, our solidarity.
Yeah, and I think the best of the Australian character as well, the fact that these events and these things are really surging for all the revised history, for all the mythology, for all the lies. It's still shining through, and it's a credit to the nation.
But the fact that here in Victoria at the moment, you're going to have a Black Lives Matter protest, but apparently you can't have an Anzac Day march, shows that we can't take any of these things for granted.
No, correct. And look, hopefully there's a tipping point and people will see the disconnect and it will change in some point sometime soon. But one more question, and I do appreciate it's without notice, but Mr. Abbott, when can we expect your next piece in The Spectator?
Look, I've promised Rowan a book review, and hopefully I'll deliver it on Monday, and it'll be in The Spectator next Thursday and Friday.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, Mr. Abbott, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck for the rest of your trip in Melbourne.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.